3 warships, 1 morning, and a 15-year-old boy who survived all 3 sinkings. This is the unbelievable true story of Wenman Wykeham-Musgrave. Before the war, life at sea was a career. Musgrave was born in 1899 and grew up in southern England. As a teenager, he joined the Royal Naval College in Greenwich, a quiet, disciplined place where young officers trained for the fleet. He had just begun his training when the world shifted. He studied navigation, discipline and command, all under the shadow of Britain's mighty navy. In August 1914, Britain went to war with Germany. At just 15 years old, Musgrave was sent to HMS Aboukir, an older warship guarding the North Sea. She wasn't fast and she wasn't well protected, but she carried the pride of the Royal Navy. For many, it was the first real assignment. For him, it would be his last peaceful moment. It was just after sunrise on September 22, 1914. HMS Aboukir was patrolling the North Sea, sailing in calm waters just off the Dutch coast. Most of the crew were awake. Some were on deck, others below drinking tea or cleaning gear. Then, without warning, a violent explosion ripped through the ship's starboard side. Steam and seawater rushed into the corridors. At first, they thought it was just a mine, but they were wrong. A German submarine U-9 had fired a torpedo into her hull. The lights went out and panic spread almost instantly. The ship started to tilt dangerously to the left. Musgrave was thrown to the floor, struggling to find balance as the ship tilted beneath his feet. Officers shouted orders. Men ran for lifeboats, but it was too late. Within 25 minutes, the cruiser rolled over and capsized completely. Hundreds were trapped below deck with no chance of escape. Musgrave managed to leap into the cold, oil-covered sea, reaching for anything that would float. He had survived the first sinking, but the worst was yet to come. Musgrave found himself thrashing in the freezing North Sea, gasping for air among waves thick with oil and wreckage. All around him, terrified sailors cried for help or drifted lifelessly in the water. The Aboukir was gone, disappearing beneath the waves in mere minutes. Clinging desperately to floating debris, Musgrave felt exhaustion and hypothermia setting in rapidly. Every breath burned, every second felt like eternity. Just as Musgrave felt his strength slipping away, a silhouette appeared on the horizon. HMS Hogue was racing to rescue survivors. A wave of relief washed over him. He was safe, or so he believed. But beneath the surface, the deadly U-9 was already preparing its next attack. Musgrave was pulled aboard HMS Hogue, shaking from cold and shock. His lips were blue, his hands barely able to grasp the blankets the crew quickly wrapped around him. All around, survivors from Aboukir lay collapsed on the deck, shocked, coughing, trembling. Some were crying, others just stared at the sea in shock. For a moment, it seemed they were safe. Suddenly, a deafening explosion tore through the air. The whole ship shook from the impact. HMS Hogue had been hit. U-9 had fired again. The torpedo slammed into her side, twisting metal and ripping upper parts of the ship. Water rushed in fast, surging through the lower decks like a living thing. Panic spread instantly. Men screamed, and officers shouted over the chaos, trying desperately to restore order as the ship began to list. Musgrave struggled to stay on his feet as the deck began to tilt. His heart was pounding. As he ran for the rail, he already knew what was coming. For the second time that morning, he jumped into the freezing sea. His body still numb from the first sinking. And once again, he was on his own, struggling to stay afloat in an endless nightmare. Musgrave was still floating in the freezing sea, barely able to keep his head above water. He had already survived 2 sinkings, and his body was reaching its limit. Then, once again, salvation appeared on the horizon. It was HMS Cressy, the third cruiser in the squadron. She slowed down and began taking in survivors from the water, her crew reaching out with ropes and life-saving gear. Musgrave was pulled aboard, weak and soaked, barely able to stand. Around him, more men from Aboukir and Hogue were being rescued. For the second time that morning, he thought he might be safe, but U-9 was still out there. Just as before, the submarine struck again. A torpedo hit Cressy's port side, followed soon after by another. As the ship began to tilt, panic broke out once more. Officers shouted, men scattered, and some jumped overboard before the ship could roll. Musgrave didn't wait. He had learned what happened to those who hesitated, and so, for the third time in a single hour, he threw himself into the sea, fighting to survive the cold, the chaos, the impossible. By some miracle, Musgrave survived the third sinking. He was pulled from the sea by a Dutch merchant ship and brought to safety. That morning, he had faced death not once, not twice, but 3 separate times, and lived to tell the tale. He was only 15 years old. In the years that followed, he stayed in the Navy and kept a low profile. He never looked for attention, and very few people knew what had happened to him. There were no medals, no headlines, just the memory of cold water, torn steel, and the voices of those who didn't make it. He later returned to civilian life, carrying that day with him for the rest of his years. Today, the names of Aboukir, Hogue and Cressy are mostly forgotten, lost in the early days of the First World War. But somewhere in that chaos, a boy endured the impossible. His story may be unknown, but it's one worth remembering. Because sometimes history doesn't need heroes. It just needs someone who refuses to give up. If you know of someone whose story deserves to be told, someone history has forgotten, let me know in the comments. I would love to explore it in a future video. Thank you for watching.